And this is...
I'm Harry Walton, economist at the Environment Agency, and we did some work with Solutions on dependency modelling a couple of years ago.
Yep. So we thought we'd take you through what dependency modelling is and illustrate it with an example which had some evaluative elements in it. It's work that we did together, and it's all around understanding and valuing flood risk management activities. Yes. So this is what we'll cover, the introduction, case study, and then strengths and weaknesses of the approach from our perspective, from our experience of using it. So I'll start with talking about the technique, but first just a little bit about complex systems. In CECAN, we are responsible for trying to improve the practice of evaluation of interventions that are affecting change in complex systems. And complex systems are characterised by having many diverse interacting components. And the way these interactions work, they often lead to very non-linear behaviours at the system level. So you can have a complex system like a social system, or a social system which is interacting with a natural system, which is one of the things that CECAN is really interested in. You'll put an intervention in place, perhaps trying to change people's behaviours around energy use, whatever, and you don't observe any change for quite a long time. It can go along with not much happening, and then suddenly it will reach a threshold or a tipping point, and change will start happening very rapidly. And sometimes that can be quite unexpected. It is really quite difficult to understand and predict what might happen in a complex system. It can also be quite resilient to change. So you might see some change happening, and then as the system evolves and adapts to what's going on, what the intervention is doing, you find that that change starts to dampen down. It starts to cease happening. And if you take the intervention away, the system can snap right back into the original state that you started with. So it just goes back to position one. And these really present challenges to evaluators, because what you find can depend critically at the moment you go in and start your evaluation. And when you leave, things can start happening and changing, and the eventual outcomes can be quite different to what you might have thought they were going to be. They're also very difficult to characterise, so data can be sparse, can be variable quality, difficult and expensive to collect. So basically not easy for evaluators. So why use dependency modelling? Well, modelling approaches are central to many, maybe perhaps most evaluations, I think. Theory of change is an example, and that was developed specifically to try and deal with complexity in social systems in evaluation. But it has been criticised for being too linear. Quite often the theory of change maps that we produce are sort of threads leading through from our intervention activities through outputs and into outcomes, which are really a number of threads which are really quite independent of each other. And we don't properly account for the interactions between them, the interactions between those threads and what's going on in other related programs, and with the outside world, what's changing in the outside world. And one of the things that dependency modelling can do is it can help make those many links and dependencies clear. And so you can really show what can affect your system as well as your intervention. And it provides a framework for synthesising all sorts of evaluation information. And critically, I think, where resources are constrained, for using expert judgment and experience from the ground in a systematic way, so to give it a bit more robustness, moving away from just anecdotal information. So what are they? Compact way of representing system problems graphically. Basically a series of blobs and lines. The blobs represent variables in the system. The lines show how they interact with one another to lead to outcomes. This is a very simple one, but below these will be lots more of interconnecting elements that shows how the system is working towards outcomes. Critically for evaluation, you can help you explore and display causal relationships between key factors and how that works through the system to influence the outcomes. They're developed in a highly collaborative way, so you get lots of people together in a workshop from all different parts of the system, people responsible for implementing the intervention, designing the intervention, the people that are affected by the intervention, to build a common understanding of how the system is working, how the intervention is working within the system. And this qualitative map that you build together can be really the most powerful part of the whole process. It helps them build a common understanding of what's going on and what may be going on, and it allows you to capture different perspectives, and in complex environments they can be, you don't reach a common understanding. You can have quite different perspectives of what's important, how things are interacting, what impacts they're having, but you can display all that on the diagram and show that. And you can quantify them. There's lots of different software products available that help you to quantify them as a statistical model that will allow you to calculate the costs and benefits of your intervention. They go under a whole range of different names. Some of them mean slightly different things. We tend to use dependency modelling or influence mapping or diagramming because basically if you go in a room and say you're about to build a Bayesian belief net, people run screaming out of the room. How are they used in evaluation? Well, not a great deal, we think. We haven't come across many examples. They were designed to support decision making, so you can put down the options and explore how different options might work through to outcomes. But quite often when you're doing that, the first thing you do is look at what is the current situation. And so that's an evaluative activity. We think they could be very powerful. And the example we're going to talk through did do some evaluative type thinking and activity. They clearly, you can use them to provide a representation of theory of change that is reflects much more the complexity of the interactions in the system and how the intervention is interacting with that. They can guide division of a program-wide theory of change into more readily manageable chunks that you can look at in your evaluation independently, but without losing sight of how those segments are related to one another and related to the outside world. And it helps you make conscious decisions about what's going to be inside and outside your evaluation and how you might then deal with those things that you have left external to your evaluation. And using the quantification, you can also help us identify where additional information will materially strengthen the confidence you have in the findings. So where you've used expert judgment, if that's particularly critical to your understanding of the impact your intervention is having, it will tell you that, and you can go and try and get better information in that area of the model. So moving on to the case study. This was a piece of work that we started, an initial project that was set up by the Environment Agency and we did with Decision Labs, where we were looking at two particular areas of flood risk management activity: modelling, mapping and data, and stakeholder engagement. And what people have been finding was that it was actually very difficult to evaluate these, to establish what costs and benefits they were delivering, compared with the more solid flood defences, concrete in the ground type affairs, where there were more accepted ways of doing the quantification, doing the evaluation. And so the project was a trial to see if we could use this technique to help evaluate these. The real challenges was things like modelling, mapping and data does not manage flood risk in themselves. They don't prevent people's properties flooding, but they are absolutely critical to deciding what flood risk activities you should do, prioritising those activities, how you should design flood barriers, for example. And stakeholder engagement activities do have a direct impact. They help people prepare for floods and they help people minimise the impact once a flood occurs. But floods are normally, but not always, for people, relatively rare events. So again, measuring the benefit you've got from doing the activity when an event doesn't happen can be quite hard. So we started off with the lots of people in a room, yellow stickies, pink stickies, sticking it all up to get the first iteration of a map, and that's beautifully fuzzed out for confidentiality reasons probably, but that's the stakeholder engagement map, the very first iteration that we developed. We then started to iterate towards a more formal representation, a neater, tidy one, and the Environment Agency people who were in the room developing that first map got really engaged in this process, and they worked between workshops on these maps, talking to their colleagues, making additional changes to them. So they were happy that they represented what they did and how what they did contributed to outcomes and what other factors could affect that. We then went on to do a model quantification just to demonstrate the principles, and the first step in any quantification is usually to simplify the model because it makes quantification easier. That's not a fundamental problem, because when you start to quantify, that should be an iterative process as well. So when you find what the areas of uncertainty or important significance are in terms of making judgments about how these activities are affecting these outcomes, you can start to refine the model and build more detail in where you think it's needed. We use, there's a number of ways you can do the quantification, but we use probabilistic expressions to express the relationship between the various factors. And this has two advantages. It allows you to capture the uncertainty implicit in expert judgment, and it also allows you to capture the uncertainty that is implicit in the very, very complex processes by which these engagement activities lead to reduced impacts, reduced flooding impacts. And as probabilistic, you end up with probability distributions as your outcome. So this is just an example of the sort of thing you get. This green line was the distribution of outcomes expected from current activities. So this is basically your evaluation of the impact that you're getting from your activities, and we've got sort of an average expected value of something like 400 benefit units, whatever they are. And the red line shows that in this particular case we went on to think about, well, what happens if we've got more resources? Not an exercise that you really need to do very much these days, but this showed that actually you've got a broader distribution. We expected to actually overall, on average, get more benefit, but down this end there are some outcomes that are negative. So we've made some investment and got no benefit, so there's a risk that that might happen. The software model does all this maths for you. All you in the room have to do as experts and stakeholders is to assign the probabilities, and the facilitator takes you through that. The maths is done by the software. And it also allows you to do a whole range of sensitivity analyses, so you can start to explore what's driving this negative behaviour, for example, or where you've had to rely absolutely on expert judgment, which are the uncertainties that if you could make those more certain would give you more confidence in the results. So I shall hand over to Harry, who will tell us what DA actually got from this.
Lots, is the answer. As Helen mentioned, it's quite hard to do cost-benefit analysis around some activities that don't involve concrete in the case of flood defence, but I think it's actually anything where you've got something which is part of the system and where the system delivers outcomes altogether. To be able to pick out one aspect of that and say what is the cost-benefit ratio of this particular activity, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, the systems deliver the outcomes, not individual activities. You need to know about how changes in those activities might influence outcomes. You can't just look at the absolute value of them. And I guess on a more practical basis, some of our colleagues want to know what their benefit cost ratio is so they can then use it to go and negotiate for more resource. And we're spending our time trying to help them to do that, only to then have to help the next team and then the next team and the next team. It's all rather tedious. So this is actually, we found it as quite a good way of framing these issues and trying to present it in terms of something that is very, very true to the system, whilst at the same time enabling you to look at impact. So we quite enjoyed looking at this bit of work. So we started off with this trial, and it's very limited, only looking at one bit of the system. The quantification, we did do that, but it didn't really use any quantitative benefits analysis, so it's really just looking at effectiveness really. When we as we were finishing that, the 2015 spending review came along, so we knew about this and started thinking about it, I guess, in the autumn of 2014. Lots of interest from the Treasury. We were only ever really interested in our capital budget before, which was just building flood defences. That's all they ever really asked us about. We can quantify that stuff relatively easily. Well, it's hard, but we've done it a lot. They never used to ask us about the equivalent sum of money, about 300 million, which we spent on revenue activities. Given, I guess, the atmosphere around SR15, which was very much austerity, very much interested in reducing our revenue budget and wanted to know what the hell we were doing with the money and whether we were just spending it on hot plants and away days and that sort of thing. Maybe we did. So we needed to do something which explained what all these activities were, also what return they gave us. We needed to describe the costs, and we needed to do some scenario analysis. Unfortunately, it wasn't increasing resources. No. 15% reductions, 30% reductions we were looking at. We thought we could have a go at doing some dependency modelling around this. We called it value chain analysis. That was just something that's going on in the agency at the time, taken from utilities and water companies who talk about the different stages of finding clean water, for example, and there's a language of value chain around that. So we nicked that and applied it to this because we couldn't get on with Bayesian belief network either. So I'm going to use that phrase a lot in this, but it's basically a dependency model. It's worked for us. So I guess we did it in 6 months. We must have done maybe probably 12 to 15 all-day workshops with colleagues, which I think is probably more than you'd ever be able to get away with in normal applications. So we're quite lucky in that regard, but we use the spending review as a bit of a stick to get people to turn up. I don't think they would have turned up if we'd have just said, well, if we called it actually what it was, I suppose. But they did, they were quite involved in it. Quite hesitant at first, it's very tedious doing these post-it note things. People just want to get the stuff out of their filing cabinets, which looks a little bit similar to a systems map. They just want to give you that. Yeah. Which kind of defeats the purpose of getting a shared vision of how the system works and having that discussion and that challenge. So it took a bit of effort for us to persuade them to put all that stuff away and just start again. But they generally got really into it as we went through, and most of the workshops they ran to a certain extent. So this is how we interpret it, the quantification exercise. So I'm going to have a go at doing this because I appreciate it's a bit of a leap from some of the dependency models that Hannah showed you before and those results. So again, I called it a value chain. This is around providing spatial planning advice, so commenting on planning applications, which we do quite a bit on whether it's in the floodplain and what mitigation measures there might need to take place. So generally speaking, there's a planning application, we have a map of the area, a flood risk map, we give some planning advice, and if they take our advice, they'll avoid flood damage. That's generally the logic. So this is like a decision tree. There's a planning proposal. Now, if you're an environment agency person sat in the regional office in Tewkesbury or somewhere like that, you might have a really good bespoke map of that area, or you might just have a really low-res thing. Bit of potluck. If you've got a bit of money and time, you might get a bespoke map made. But generally speaking, if you've got a good map, you can give some good tailored advice. And so this is just an example. So don't worry about the numbers, they're not necessarily accurate. But generally speaking, if you've got a good map, you'll probably get your advice accepted, or you've got a relatively high chance of doing that. Whereas if you've got a bad map, it's a bit low res, it's quite hard to be credible. You might end up with more 50-50 chance of getting your advice accepted. So here's how you quantify it. I've sort of said that if your advice is rejected, there's still a benefit of 2 million because they'll probably take some of your thoughts on board, but not all of them. Whereas if you get the advice accepted, it's 10 million. It's arbitrary numbers. And so what you get is you can multiply the probabilities together. 60% times 80% equals 48%. You see what I mean? And you can do it for each of those nodes. And then you can multiply it by the values. You can sort of see the maths in that. It's quite basic, really. So you end up with a 68% chance of getting a £10 million benefit. That's the sum of this and this multiplied by 10 million. Or you have a 32% chance of getting a 50-50 benefit. That's basically it. You get an average value of 7.44 million. If you did one scheme, you'd never get a benefit of 7.44 million. You'd either get 2 or 10. But if we did loads and loads and loads and loads of them, then on average you might expect to get 7.44. So it's kind of an expected value. So if you do scenario analysis with that, you could say, well, what if we had all bespoke maps? We did everything, so we actually invested some money, 100% bespoke maps. Well, you can see the benefit increases by about £1 million up to 8.4. Or you could say, what if that fell down to 30%? You have a decrease of 0.72. So that's basically it. The software will do all the probability calculations, and in very complicated models with lots of probabilities, you can't just do them quickly like that. And the benefits values and the probability data which you provide are sort of the raw materials. I think that's roughly how it works. Chris, is that roughly how it works?
Yeah, I mean, drawing it as a tree like that is a very kind of, they get very big very quickly.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of disadvantage of drawing it in a tree structure rather than a very compact fluids diagram type structure that allows you to add the same information but in a much more compact and single sheet of paper view of it.
Yeah.
The maths is the same.
Yeah. Okay, so we've done that for our main map. You probably can't read that. I've got a simplified version, so don't try and read everything. This is the entire flood risk management business and environment agency on one page. First time ever. It was actually quite interesting just on its own. We could have stopped there and done anything else. What you've got here, though, you can see the colours. The yellow ones are activities. That's stuff we spend money on, sort of verbs, basically. And then the pink ones are what are the outputs, or what those activities produce. And normally what you get is you get an activity which leads to an output which then feeds into another activity. You use that to produce another output which then feeds into another activity, and eventually you get the dark red sort of things which are the outcomes. And for us, we just called that avoided flood damages. There's actually a raft of outcomes if you look at our strategy. for flood risk. There's loads of them, but the economist in me just says that's just avoided flood damage and leave it at that. So the original map with all the detail in it was, I guess we could probably wallpaper this whole room with it, but we've sort of summarised it down to that. I'll talk you through it in a little bit more detail. So this is the same thing, but I just merged the activities and the outputs together, so it's just a little easier to read. This version is really a modelling map. It's not really meant for presentation. No, we did present around it quite a lot actually, but this is easier. Is that visible? Is it? Yeah. So just quickly, I know we're on dependency modelling, but you might be interested in this. This normally starts with some sort of risk assessment at the beginning, so we assess risk, or we have evidence on flood risk, and there's data, so river telemetry networks, and radar, and that sort of thing, collecting lots of data. And then there's mapping and modelling outputs, which basically take that data and turn it into some sort of product. Now that stuff basically then gets used across the rest of the business to deliver flood defence. Really, that's kind of the genesis of it all. Though the strength of relationships between these isn't all that it seems actually. But if you just come into building renewing assets, so this is basically building flood defences. They'll take these maps and models and they'll use it to design new flood defences. Actually, what happens is these guys will use these models, think, is it worth building a flood defence there? And then they'll probably commission another model again, which will be really, really detailed and like a 3D model of the area, very, very sophisticated. And then that is linked up with, I won't go through everything, but it's a couple of the key bits. Some engagement activities, but also partnership funding. So flood defence is match funded in this country now. We get money from private sources and also from other public sector sources to augment our government grant, and we use that to build defences. And actually, if you've got more partnership funding contributions, is what we call it, then there's a bigger chance that scheme is going to go ahead, and some of them won't go ahead at all unless they have funding from other sources. So getting money and going around with the begging bowl, such as it is quite a big deal for us. It's been a major transformation in the policy in the last few years, going from just basically engineers to sort of salespeople, as well as engineers, as well as everything else. So that's quite a big deal. I'll come back to that one. And then there's a process of delivering the flood defences, essentially. Then we also use it for inspecting risk. So we look after the existing defences we've got. We've got a few thousand kilometres of them. People going around with clipboards, looking at them. Prioritisation and then delivering the maintenance stuff itself. But then this more interesting stuff is around managing incidents. So they take the data to do forecasts of flood risk. So Met Office have got some stuff for doing that, which helps us establish whether a flood has come in, and then that triggers all the warnings and that sort of thing, which you might see on, or may not see on the television and on our website and wherever else. And then we manage the incident. So we say, well, the fire brigade actually do a lot. You'll see most of that, and then the army look good on the TV, but they also help when there's an incident. But we basically go around and we shut floodgates. We pull up the Thames barrier or drop the Thames barrier and do all that sort of stuff. So actually just activating flood defences is pretty much what we do in that regard. And also cleaning up channels if they get blocked up full of stuff to, sort of pinch points by bridges and that sort of thing. We'll go in there and dig some of that stuff out. So this is his incident response on the ground thing here. So if you've got lots of flood defences and you don't operate them when you need to, it's kind of a waste of time having flood defences in the first place. So having this link here from mapping and modelling via managing, doing forecasts and warning, through to operating the assets, to delivering basically the benefits of having flood defence is quite important. That sort of stuff tends to get neglected though. We've got some forecasts and models over here, and some people who manage assets over here. They don't necessarily realise their sort of mutual codependency. That's quite an interesting result from doing some of this work. And then the bottom bit here is the planning advice, which I spoke about before. So we've got this link here from planning advice to partnership funding. That's actually that one arrow there. We spend about £3 million on that. It's not a lot out. It's probably 1% of our budget, a bit less. The revenue budget. That is probably the most important relationship on the entire map, out of all of them. It's basically what's happening there is we've got people talking to local authorities just about flood risk, and while they're there, they get all sorts of leads around funding opportunities and basically sales leads really, which they then take advantage of and then feed back into the capital programme to actually bring in the money. And if we didn't do that, then probably half of the outcomes of flood defence just couldn't be realised. We couldn't build any defences under the current model. So but this was a byproduct of something which we're actually reducing the budget for. It's quite incredible, really. The message there is not that we need to carry on doing that. Sorry, we don't necessarily need to carry on doing that activity. We definitely need to carry on speaking to local authorities is the kind of the message behind it. But some of that stuff got a little bit lost. Anyway, I'll skip on. Oh, you can see how these feed through to the outcomes at the end there. We priced them up using some economics, which I won't bore you with, but we've got some pounds values for those ones at the end. Okay, so this is really interesting as well. It's about structuring cost data. So I mentioned before that we needed to tell the Treasury what we were spending the money on. If you ask us what we're doing our budgets, I bet actually all these organisations, and particularly the government departments here, would probably end up doing the same. So we said, what do you spend your money on? You'll say, well, we spend this much money on people, this much money on IT, and probably this much money on facilities, and there'll be a list of sort of stuff like that, ingredients like that. Well, if you ask me what my job was, I would say I speak on the phone, I get on the train, and I sit at a desk. I mean, they're equally as useful, really, aren't they? They don't really describe what you're doing with the money or what you're doing with your time. So, I mean, it's true, I do get on the train and that sort of thing, but I'm also an economist doing this. So what we did is we used the activity map that we came up with, so the influence map, we used that to structure our cost information. So we basically had to get our finance guys to match up cost data against these activities. So we had a little bit of time recording data, some other assumptions. Team managers might just sit there and try and work out, well, we spend roughly about this much of our time doing this, or this much of our time doing this, and just try and come up with a picture of exactly what we're doing. So we did that. It was really useful, actually. We do that a lot now for other bits of our work. So here's the capital budget bit itself, at 287 million, but then you've got all these other activities which are revenue funded, including the engagement, actually, which is revenue funded, which are also delivering capital programme outcomes. Well, we couldn't really say that before. It wasn't possible. We had a capital budget and a revenue budget, but actually they depend on each other, and this work sort of pulled that out. So yeah, the costing of activities is one of our main reasons for doing this, actually. I'm doing it again for some of our stuff on river work at the moment. So in terms of the results, we hadn't showed us some of this stuff here. We did produce this stuff with Chris's help using the software. We kind of ran out of time to make it bland, really. I have to admit, I don't think we really understood what we got. Well, we had these distributions, but there were some other really, really sort of niche outputs, like the tornado diagrams, which I won't even attempt to explain, but they sort of show some of the dependency of outcomes on changes in the activities, but really hard. Well, first of all, they don't look that great, so you have to get all that stuff out and turn it into something a bit more meaningful for, or at least the style of presentation that senior colleagues are kind of used to. And then you have to convince them that it's actually telling them something interesting, and hoping that they understand intuitively what it's saying. And well, we didn't manage that, actually. I'd like to have another go at it. I think we got some unfinished business there, but it was really hard to do that. So we ended up just trying to do a bit of ranking like this, just sort of saying which are the priority activities. So you've got ones up here which have probably got a really, really direct link to outcomes. If you don't look after flood defence, it won't work, and then that'll be that. So that's quite an important one. Through to some stuff which is a bit more uncertain about the impact it has. One I should point out is assurance. We do a lot of scrutiny of business cases of capital schemes as they go through. It's important that we do that. The National Audit Office like it, DEFRA like it. Do we need to spend more time doing it? Well, no, probably not really. If anything, it would just end up causing more delays. As people poured more and more over the data, it wouldn't necessarily influence the outcomes. There might be some additional efficiencies, but it wouldn't necessarily be a benefit. So those sorts of things there is sort of saying, yes, it's important that we do it. They are important to delivering the outcomes, but don't do it to the nth degree. So we've got a list of activities like that, and some other ones which sort of fall into the middle. And that sort of stuff has been generally useful for informing allocation decisions. Yeah, I'd say that's about as far as it goes. But to say that we're actually using this in order to plan and map resources across businesses, that's not strictly true. The information has been handy, sort of contextual knowledge. So here's some of the stuff we did get. There's a probability distribution here. So the grey, is it grey? I guess it's grey. Lines show the distribution of outcomes prior to the efficiency savings, budget cuts, and then the yellow ones show what would happen without it. You can see it's these big splits. It's a sort of binomial distribution that you've got there, which was kind of interesting because it sort of says, well, in either case, you may have a mean outcome level, which was probably sort of somewhere here. That's sort of roughly in between. Yeah, you can sort of envisage it being there. But actually, you're probably never ever going to achieve that. It's either going to go really well for you and you'll deliver loads of outcome, or you'll probably be somewhere at the low end. You're not really going to be anywhere in the middle. So using stuff like average benefits is kind of irrelevant. You're going to be a bit split. So one, we thought, yes, we need to tell people about this. I think the other thing could be is that our model is quite binary in the way in which we define the probabilities. So that could be what it is. We basically took each activity and said, would we do this well, or would we do this not so well, or would we spend this much money on this much money? Whereas actually it's probably there's a lot more choices along there. It could be various levels of expenditure you could make on it. So it could be that the model's picking up some of the binary nature of the data there. I guess we could spend some more time looking at that to unpack if that was the case, but we never got as far as that. But that said though, that's pretty much what we've done with it. We did use it for our spending review submission. We didn't show them all of that stuff. We focused really on more the benefit cost information, I guess, that it produced, which is more interesting to Treasury and more familiar to our senior colleagues, I guess. But that said, though, it's been really, really powerful in helping us to basically understand our business model, I suppose. But those maps showing the activities and the links, we haven't got that at all anywhere else. We weren't really expecting to deliver that as part of this, but so we have. And that's been quite interesting. I bet most other government departments probably haven't got anything that comprehensive, I wouldn't have thought. That's probably just to do with the way in which the public sector operates. But so we've done quite a lot of that sort of thing. There's lots of people really interested in us doing it again, but they're mainly interested in those one-page maps, which look quite good, I have to admit. And then some of the cost information. I haven't had anybody ask me to do any quantitative dependency modelling yet, and I think even if they did, I'd probably say no at the moment, well, at least until we've probably worked out a more satisfactory way of processing the results and trying to get it across and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's certainly been very worthwhile. That's what we did. And do you want to
just summarise the paper?
Yeah. No, you can leave that if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is what we would recommend for when to use it, especially for evaluation. For any application really, where there are lots of interacting, intersecting issues, so you've got a lot of complexity and multiple different stakeholders and perspectives, because just getting people in the room to talk about those is very powerful. Where data is sparse or of variable quality, and where things like local knowledge and expert judgment is what really is available, on which you can base your evaluation. And where outcomes are certain, because of this probabilistic way of developing the quantification, if you use that, then it's really well suited for situations where you're not quite sure how things are going to pan out, but you can have some thoughts about that. What are the strengths? Harry did the map to the whole of the Environment Agency and all their activities and got through to the submissions in 6 months, so it is a rapid process. It does help you focus on what the key elements of your system are and uncover ones that you hadn't even realised were key elements. It does give a very powerful way of structuring thinking about complex problems and getting people to really engage with that and to challenge assumptions. So even though you might be relying a lot on expert judgment, those experts are challenging each other and you're really learning something about your system. And that highly participative process is really very important. And that whole process can be more important than the numbers that you get out at the end. You can quantify it, and that can be useful, not just to give numbers at the end of the process, but also to help with this sensitivity analysis and understanding where you should be looking for more data and information. When you first go into a room and tell people that they're going to put yellow stickies on a wall and work out anything that's going to be robust and useful, you do get quite a bit of initial scepticism. But our common experience in other applications is that once you get people in there and they start doing it and get involved with it, that disappears. And people get very enthusiastic and very engaged with it. The quantification, because we base it on uncertainty, people find that difficult to work with, and it's difficult to explain. Although you don't actually have to do the number crunching, you do need to have a facilitator who understands the numbers, so that what you get out of the facilitation process is sound, robust numbers to go into the model. And I should have said earlier, Chris, who's sitting at the front here, did all that for us, because he's the expert. And really, because that going through the process is so important and so enlightening, there's always a risk that if people who haven't been part of the process take the results, they might use them out of context. I suspect that's a risk with any detailed analysis of a complex system, but I think it's particularly the case in this. But we think it is a very promising technique for helping do evaluations in complex situations, where, especially where resource might be limited. So thank you very much. Any questions?
So, a very basic question to start. You were just talking again about evaluation, but this is all based on the participants' assessment of the sort of causal relationships and probabilities of things happening, and the improvement, for example, in your first example, by the planning advice, the improvement that you got in terms of uptake. Presumably putting real data from evaluation into this would be a sort of fairly
if you have
necessary step to make it robust, because otherwise you're sort of getting a psychological bias in terms of people sort of believing that the stuff they do is important.
That's where the challenge is really quite important as well, to get rid of that bias. If you have the information you've already got, Bayesian synthesis, this type of approach is one way of bringing that into a common framework and looking at the whole system. So if you've evaluated part of your system, you can bring that data from the very beginning into your quantification, into the judgments you're making. So they don't all necessarily need to be judgment-based. But you can use judgments where you haven't got hard data. You go through quite a detailed, robust process of challenging where those judgments have come from and why you think that's the case, and writing all that down so it's transparent. And then you can run the sensitivity analyses to say, well, these judgments seem to be particularly important to our conclusions, our findings about what was important and why. And therefore, we're going to go and do more robust evaluation activities around that particular part of the system, part of the model. And so it's a way of designing and shaping the whole evaluation, I think. But yeah, you're right, you want to combine it with other methods as well, if the results suggest that that's necessary.
I'd agree with that. It was very much negotiated data. There was some disagreement over it, but it's sort of, you're aiming for consensus, and eventually people get bored of arguing, or it just goes towards a particular decision. But I don't think that's very different to what we do I normally do in appraisal for the economic analysis. There's big assumptions there which are just done on gut feel, or probably just as susceptible to bias. So I was quite relaxed about this, as I'm used to making assumptions about lots of things. But it is the key thing. If that stuff is wrong, then everything is wrong. So it's quite an important task.
Ben.
So in conventional government evaluations, you often have a multi-year thing or a big policy. How do you see dependency modelling fitting in? Would it substitute for the theory of change at the beginning, where you kind of formulate your theory of change and then update it throughout the process? Or is substituting in for that?
My feeling is yes, but I shall hand over to Chris. I think it's clearly a good way of developing a theory of change, which takes into account more interactions.
I think that's right. Time frame is an interesting one, because whenever you're doing one of these kind of expert judgment assessments, you have to have in your mind over what time horizon am I saying that this effect is going to operate. Because the answers that you get might be very different if you're saying, you've got to keep a 2-year framework in your mind versus a 30-year time horizon in your mind. And so actually you could completely redraw some of those maps with a short-term focus versus a long-term focus, and have two completely different pictures.
And as time goes by and you get to understand more about the system, and you get more evaluation information coming in, formal evaluation information coming in, the maps will change again because you understand the system better. So like a theory of change, they will grow and change as your understanding of what is actually happening and your testing of links in those chains improves.
And how sensitive is it to your understanding of the current situation? Because I mean that's something that we often get wrong. We think about, our understanding of the status quo is so conditioned by our perception biases.
Yeah, well, clearly, if you start...
Well, it's not a crystal ball, is it? It's only going to be as good as...
I mean, can you run the sensitivity analysis backwards, if you like? So you're doing a sensitivity analysis on the outcomes. Can you also run the sensitivity analysis backwards?
You can play with whether you've got the structure of the model right, and you can see whether, well, if I assumed this looked different, what would happen if I assumed that the probabilities are different? What would happen? You can do a lot of bells and whistles on sensitivity analysis. I think the good thing about I've been to lots of workshops. We do that a lot in the work we do, where you're trying to talk about systems and elicit information and thoughts from people. I find the particular way these start to get structured extremely useful in posing a discipline on people, and they do get into the process of really trying to understand what is going on at the moment. And you get the right people in the room, obviously, because you need to get that challenge going. You need to have people who will say, no, I don't think so, that's wishful thinking, sure, that's not how it works on the ground. But when you get that working properly and people get enthusiastic, engaged with the process, you get a lot of honesty coming out, and you will get that picture well defined and developed, I think.
You said at the beginning that theories change maps often not linear, but I didn't spot any sort of feedback loops in terms of this model.
Yeah, we can't put feedback loops into this when you're using the mathematics that we use. They're acyclic directed graphs. They have to go in straight lines. And basically, for a theory of change, something is there, you put something in, that changes with time. So they're moving forward in time. So no, they don't represent feedbacks. And we are actually doing work at CECAN with Alex there, looking at whether we can start with a proper systems map looking down at all those feedbacks, all that complexity and interactions fully developed and devised, and then flip that into a theory of change, which is a slice through time in that map, and see if that gives us better theories of change. But you could then express that better theory of change as a dependency model, and still recognise all those interactions.
Would you take it in a different direction into a sort of agent-based model, where you, if you were positing that certain activities not only had sort of direct outcomes, but they also led to better engagement with local communities and local governments or whatever, and then that fed back into the partnership strategy. Would that be another way of dealing with it?
You certainly could. We do agent-based modelling as well. And,
obviously, you're talking about an order of magnitude, or several orders of magnitude, potentially more expensive and time-consuming process. So. Yeah. This often starts as let's have a really rapid, holistic assessment of our overall system and do it quickly using just expert judgment and get it onto one page. And then when you've done that, then that's the jumping off point for all of these more detailed levels of.
The other thing we've done is have a really quite a very simple high-level dependency model, but fed that with more detailed simulation modelling or whatever underneath to feed aspects of it. So you can also use it to pull a bigger thing together. But you wouldn't want to model the Environment Agency with an agent-based model, would you? But we are prepared to do it for you.
I find it really interesting because everything's horses for courses. So totally. I'm not remotely sort of criticising the correctness of this, but it seems to me it's a sort of structured and sort of more inclusive way of making some providing management information rather than a sort of something which is truly looking at what might be emergent behaviour over time, so organisations interact and stuff like that. So it's more of it's really a management
Yeah.
The only way you could take that is if you had people who knew a bit about the system, who'd been studying the system, modelling the system, could then, as Chris says, at this first high-level look, when you talk about, well, what's the likely outcomes, they can start to say, well, we think this is from our modelling, this is what's going to happen, and therefore the outcomes are likely to look like this. So you can fold it into the whole thinking process, but you can't reproduce an agent-based model with this type of model. You might use it to scope out a big and complicated model, to think what bits are we going to really need to model in some detail, but don't know.
I think I can't see how we could. What the biggest hurdle we actually had is one of them is we were sort of saying that the teams and the activities within the Environment Agency could be good or they could be bad, depending on the level of resource and just the fact that it's all probabilistic. My colleagues had quite a hard time with that, because normally they say we do this activity and we deliver this output and this outcome. So to actually say that we could do everything as well as we can, then it might go wrong, or you might not end up with the result that you were looking for, was actually quite problematic. So that we managed to get around it because it was a quick thing. But with the agent-based model, if we were to model them as each team as an agent who might do something well or do something badly or behave randomly or something, I think that would be really, really difficult for my colleagues to spend any money or time on that, actually. So that could be certainly would be a hurdle for us.
We modelled the Environment Agency in the Water Abstraction
Did
Reform
you?
agent-based model as an
but
agent making decisions.
But DEFRA procured that, didn't they?
Yes,
They probably see us as...
And I don't think you only made decisions on information you could possibly have at the time, so you weren't omniscient, but I don't think we allowed you to make terrible mistakes.
Yeah.
And that sort of... when we were... the agent-based models we have for foot-and-mouth disease control, where we have to have vets not properly... injecting and doing vaccination, that caused an awful lot of
this suggests that it even be possible.
Yes, well, we never get it wrong. So yes, it really is going into another world, but using agent-based modelling. But it's very, very powerful, but very slow. I would suggest. I'm sure you can do a quick and dirty one, but you quickly get sucked into detail because that's what they're all about. You avoid that with this sort of approach.
So when you deal with stuff like theory of no change, then it's actually have no impact or tipping points. Is to put in much higher values for this having an impact at a certain threshold or something.
What do you think?
So theory of no change would be this activity continues as it is and it continues to deliver the outcome that it has always done, and there's very little chance or almost no chance of any improvement result. And
you can also put into the model, you can put in other factors driving the outcomes. Yeah. So that gives you the idea, well, would it have happened anyway?
Yeah.
And you make specific structured decisions about what the likelihood is that this was producing this or this other alternative competing mechanism was producing it. And so you can start to see whether it really was you that was responsible for that, or whether...
That's one of the key, when you're doing the elicitation for this, one of the key questions is, what's the chance of this happening anyway? Even if you made no change, what's the chance of this happening anyway?
And so the counterfactual questions are built in as part of the method. You can't get away from it. Which is nice. Stops people forgetting about it.
Why do you think it hasn't been used more widely? Is it just because it's relatively new and novel?
It's not new and novel. It's been around since the 1990s or 80s, since software got cleverer.
Yes, it came out of Stanford originally, this kind of whole area, and really took off in the decision support arena once you had kind of graphical user interfaces. So from the mid-1980s onwards, and you had kind of click and drag methods for drawing the nodes and the arrows.
I think there's a nervousness in using something which is asking you to think at a high level, which is asking you to think about probability and likelihood, which is saying that
we were surprised that it hasn't really been used for evaluation at all.
Yeah.
It's always been forward forecasting kind of context,
and
decision support context.
In that sense, this sort of model, I think, underpins things like Google search engines and things like that. They're running and automatically updating this sort of model all the time to decide what it is you're really searching for when your spelling goes awry and all that sort of thing. So they are pervasive in terms of other applications, but perhaps, I don't know, we have our ways, don't we, in evaluation? That's probably what CECAN's all about, trying to bounce ourselves out of our set ways of doing things and think about the applicability of this sort of affair. Don't call them Bayesian belief nets. That definitely stops people using them. Anything more? Well, thank you very much for coming.
Yeah.
It's been lovely to see you.